Hi everyone, this is Kyle, and this upcoming Star Wars show, The Acolyte, it released its first trailer around almost a week or so ago at this point. Overall, it's been pretty poorly received, and it's just the latest thing coming out of Lucasfilm and coming out of Disney that, frankly, is dead on arrival if you ask me. Now, probably the biggest reason why the show is dead on arrival is because when you look at any interviews with the people that were cast in the show or Leslie Headland, they're all talking much more about identity politics. They're talking about how Star Wars is very, patriarchal. This show is going to be very diverse and stuff like that. And usually when they spend their time talking about diversity, inclusion, things like that, it's usually a sign that the story itself is not going to be very good. But one other major aspect why the show is dead on arrival is because they're following a common trend from Hollywood where they like to take the perspective of the villains, they like to humanize the villains, they like to make things morally gray. In the trailer they had this one line right here.
This isn't about good or bad.
There is no good and evil.
This is about power.
There is only power.
And who is allowed to use it?
And generally speaking, as far as I've seen people in Hollywood, when they like to blur good and evil, they tend to think it's very sophisticated to do that. When in reality, if you ask me, that's one of the major reasons why stories today suck. So right here you have Leslie Headland saying the Acolyte is going to depict the Sith as underdogs. You know, in a story, usually the underdog is a good guy. And generally speaking, the reason why we like to root for underdogs is because they tend to face a trial or face an opponent or an adversary who's way stronger than them, where this underdog, their odds of winning are not so good. And the fact that they overcome those odds and defeat whatever villain it is they face, that's what makes it a great story. And that's what makes this person, this underdog, a hero. But in this Acolyte show, the Sith or the villains are going to be the underdogs. I'll read here just a little bit of what she said. Headland made her comments in an interview with StarWars.com saying, "If Star Wars is about underdog versus the institution, kind of like rebels fighting the Empire," but she says if Star Wars is about underdog versus institution, in the Acolyte the Jedi are the institution, she continued, "I was so interested in the storyline where the Jedi were at the height of their power, and I don't mean the Phantom Menace because at that point there's a Sith Lord in the Senate that they're not picking up on." Headland went on to reveal the series asks the question what went wrong. She also added, "And if the bad guys are actually the underdog, it just seemed like a cool reversal." And this is something Hollywood likes to do now. They like to do role reversals. They like to flip things upside down. In this case, they like to take the perspective of the villain rather than the hero. And here where she's talking to Entertainment Weekly, she says, "And I just thought it was very interesting to do a show about the bad guys, and to set that during that time period made the most sense, so it's almost kind of flipped." Or so it's kind of almost flipped. We have more Jedi than you've seen in any of the Star Wars content, but at the same time, you see more morally ambiguous characters than you've seen in other Star Wars content. And when they talk about this sort of thing, they think it's very sophisticated what they're doing. But here with this more morally ambiguous characters taking perspectives of the villain, that sort of thing, here's the problem. Star Wars is a good and evil story. It's not a morally gray story. I know there's this trend going on where everything's morally gray now, but a lot of these classic stories are not morally gray. You had this quote from Charlie Barnett saying, "The best part of Star Wars is there is no good or evil, depends on what side you're standing on." Now me, I see this at first glance, I'm thinking, okay, did you even watch Star Wars? And I do wonder, how does a quote-unquote Star Wars fan end up thinking this? Because Star Wars is absolutely about good and evil. Maybe he's not really a Star Wars fan. Maybe he is a Star Wars fan, but he's only been watching the stuff that came out since Disney bought Star Wars. Maybe they get this opinion by spending all day with people in Hollywood. People that generally think that they are 100 times more sophisticated than they actually are. Maybe he watched the prequels and he got fooled by this one line right here.
Good is a point of view, anyway.
And folks, do you notice that the characters in stories that are saying good is a point of view or there is no good or evil, typically it's villains that are saying that? Do you ever notice that? I'm just saying. But regardless, it's very clear the people working on this show have no understanding of Star Wars. Again, apparently there's no good or evil in Star Wars. The showrunner for The Acolyte wants to portray the villains as the underdog. Now, if you're asking why exactly does Hollywood like to take the perspective of the villains nowadays? Why do they like to make stories more nihilistic? Why do they like to humanize evil? That's a very good question, folks. I honestly don't have an answer for that. But I tell you, folks, for all this talk of wokeness destroying stories today, and I don't like using the term woke, I do think it's used an awful lot, but it's probably the best word to describe what's going on with all our favorite stories and IPs today. While people point out that basically everything is terrible today because everything is going woke, and I do agree, I really do think that this trend where Hollywood is making everything morally gray. They're making stories more nihilistic now. They're taking perspectives of the villains. They're blurring good and evil. I really do think that trend, that morally gray trend, is killing stories just as much as going woke. Or current daying everything, whatever term you like to use. I mean, it seems to me like ever since the Game of Thrones show came out, it seems like everybody's been trying to be like Game of Thrones. And I see these people in Hollywood oftentimes raving about these types of stories, calling them complex and words like that. Now look, morally gray stories, they do have some strengths. Mainly, they can create some interesting situations where the audience can look at whatever situation it is in that story and they have to decide for themselves which character do they think is right or wrong, which character do they relate to the most. Me, I've started watching anime a little bit lately, Attack on Titan. I think that's a real good example of a story that's a bit more complex. But with that said, overall, I think these gray stories, they're not as good as they're made out to be. I think the biggest weakness of these type of stories is that you really don't see heroes in them. I mean, folks, if you look at the last, 10, 12, 15, whatever years, ask yourself this: when's the last time we've seen an actual hero in a movie? And I don't mean like a superhero from Marvel or anything like that, but I mean someone who's faced with some really daunting adversity, someone who's an underdog, someone facing terrible odds, someone who could very easily give up any time they want but they don't, someone that shows incredible courage in the face of danger, someone that faces evil and defeats it. When's the last time we've seen a story like that? If you ask me, it's the timeless type of themes that ultimately resonate with an audience. Courage, bravery, not giving up, friendship, sacrifice, things like that. And as far as I've seen, Hollywood is not putting that type of stuff in their stories anymore. And I think those types of themes, which again I think ultimately resonate with audiences and ultimately inspire audiences, I don't think you can portray those things in a morally gray story the way you can in a good and evil type of tale. And this, in a nutshell, is a big reason why I think there's really nothing good coming out today anymore. A story of heroism like Lord of the Rings, for example, I don't know if you're ever going to see something like that again, at least not from mainstream entertainment. A story of someone like Luke Skywalker risking his own life to see the good in his father and try to bring him back from the dark side, I don't think you're going to see stories like that anymore. Not from current day Lucasfilm. Because instead they're more focused on blurring good and evil, they're more focused on humanizing evil, taking the perspective of the villains, depicting the villains as the underdog, as Leslie Hendlin puts it. They think this sort of thing is very sophisticated. In reality, this sort of thing is the problem with what's being made today. This gray trend, it's not as good as Hollywood thinks it is, and it especially does not work when you just mindlessly apply it to an IP like Star Wars, a story that's very black and white, not gray. Yeah, folks, I tell you, I really do miss heroes and stories, and I miss villains that are just plain evil. We used to see that sort of thing, but not anymore. And that's a huge reason why stories today, if you ask me, are not very good. Because instead of depicting heroes, depicting the more timeless things like courage, friendship, that sort of thing, instead people in Hollywood, people in mainstream entertainment, they prefer to take the perspective of,
This isn't about good or bad.
That is why you fail.
Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you consider hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you all very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.